James Howell Howard was not a man born for mediocrity. From the moment he entered the world in Canton, China, in 1913, his life would be marked by an extraordinary journey that bridged continents, ideologies, and skies filled with fire and courage. The son of American missionaries, Howard spent much of his early childhood immersed in a foreign land, absorbing a unique perspective of the world that would later play into his decision to stand for something far greater than himself. Long before he was known as the lone defender of the 401st Bomb Group, long before he earned the highest military honor the United States could bestow, James Howard was simply a man trying to find his place, yet destiny had a different path prepared for him. Howard's early life in China offered him an appreciation for Eastern culture and discipline, but his family later returned to the United States, settling in St. Louis, Missouri. There, young James adapted quickly to the American way of life, excelling in academics and athletics. He went on to study at Pomona College in California, where he majored in pre-med with the intention of becoming a doctor like his father. Yet during his final year, something stirred inside him. The rumblings of conflict across Europe and Asia were no longer distant news headlines, they were becoming an unavoidable part of global consciousness. The skies above China, his first home, were no longer peaceful. In 1938, Howard abandoned his plans for medical school and pursued something radically different: flying. He joined the United States Navy, completing aviation training at Naval Air Station Pensacola. In an era when aviation was still seen as daring and elite, Howard took to the skies with determination. He flew carrier-based fighters, including the Grumman F-3F biplane, off ships in the Pacific. But by 1941, his life would take another dramatic turn, one that would place him in a unique group of men who would become legends long before the United States officially entered the war. That year, Claire Lee Chennault was forming a volunteer group of American pilots to assist China in its struggle against Japanese aggression. Officially known as the American Volunteer Group, AVG, they would become famous as the Flying Tigers. The opportunity to return to the skies over China, to fight for a cause that echoed with personal history, called to Howard. He resigned from the Navy and joined the AVG, flying the rugged Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. In the skies above Burma and China, Howard found his true calling. The Flying Tigers quickly earned a reputation for skill and bravery. Flying outdated aircraft against more numerous and often better-equipped adversaries, Howard and his fellow pilots honed aggressive tactics that focused on surprise and coordination. Howard himself scored 6 confirmed victories during his time with the AVG, becoming an ace and gaining the kind of combat experience few Americans had in those early years of the war. When the AVG disbanded in 1942, Howard returned to the United States, now an experienced combat pilot with victories under his belt and a name whispered with respect among military circles. Instead of returning to the Navy, he joined the U.S. Army Air Forces as a major, a natural fit given his combat background and leadership skills. His next assignment would take him to the heart of the European conflict, where the Allied bombing campaign was ramping up in both intensity and risk. By 1943, Howard was stationed in England with the 354th Fighter Group, flying the new P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was a revelation. With excellent speed, range, and maneuverability, it was the perfect escort fighter for the long-range bombing missions targeting Germany's industrial heartland. Howard quickly distinguished himself among the 356th Fighter Squadron, becoming its commanding officer. His presence inspired confidence. His combat record brought instant credibility. But it would be a single mission in early 1944 that would cement his place in history. On January 11, 1944, Howard flew an escort mission with the 401st Bomb Group over Ostersleben, Germany. It was a critical operation, targeting an aircraft production facility deep within enemy territory. The Luftwaffe, aware of the importance of the target, responded with everything it had. Swarms of enemy fighters rose to meet the bombers, and in the chaos of the battle, many of the American escorts became separated or overwhelmed. Suddenly, a group of B-17s found themselves vulnerable, with no fighter cover, except one man. Howard, flying his P-51 Mustang, spotted the bombers under siege by a large number of enemy aircraft. Instead of breaking away or waiting for reinforcements, he dove into the fight alone. What followed was an act of raw bravery that defied logic. For more than 30 minutes, Howard engaged enemy aircraft single-handedly, defending the bombers against overwhelming odds. He dove, climbed, turned, and fired with unrelenting resolve, destroying at least 3 enemy planes and damaging several others. Witnesses from the bomber crews could hardly believe what they were seeing. Again and again, Howard re-engaged the enemy, even as his own ammunition and fuel ran dangerously low. His aircraft sustained damage, but he remained in the fight. To the men in the bombers, he became a symbol of salvation, a one-man air force, one crewman later called him. When the mission concluded and the bombers made it back to base, stories of the Lone Mustang quickly spread. Howard had not only saved numerous aircraft and lives, but he had also demonstrated a level of heroism that became the stuff of legend. His actions were not just noted, they were celebrated. News of the incident reached the highest levels. The press picked up the story, and even President Franklin D. Roosevelt took note of the remarkable pilot who had turned the tide of an entire aerial engagement through sheer willpower and courage. In June 1944, Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater of operations to receive it. But to those who knew him, Howard remained humble. He did not see himself as a hero, merely a pilot doing his job. When asked about the mission, he often downplayed the intensity or redirected credit to the bomber crews he had protected. His humility only added to the respect others had for him. The remainder of the war saw Howard continue to serve with distinction. His leadership was instrumental in shaping the tactics and morale of the 354th Fighter Group, one of the most successful units in the war. By the time the conflict ended, Howard had accumulated a total of 6.33 confirmed victories, a relatively modest number compared to some aces, but each one was hard-earned and represented engagements in 2 vastly different theaters of war. What truly set Howard apart was not just the number of enemy aircraft he downed, but the way he fought, the risks he took, and the moral compass that guided him. He did not seek glory. Glory found him because of his relentless commitment to doing what was right, even when it meant flying alone into a sky filled with danger. After the war, Howard returned to civilian life with grace. He transitioned into a successful business career and even wrote a memoir, Roar of the Tiger, which recounted his experiences as a flying tiger and a fighter ace. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided the spotlight and political fame. He believed his service was part of something collective, a moment in history where ordinary men were asked to do extraordinary things. His story remains one of the most powerful examples of individual heroism during the air war over Europe. It encapsulates the very essence of the fighter-pilot ethos: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, selflessness in defense of others, and unwavering belief in a mission greater than oneself. For generations of aviators and historians, James Howard stands as a benchmark of valor, discipline, and humility. His P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that carried him into legend, remains a symbol of both technological excellence and the human spirit. In museums, on plaques, and in aviation halls of fame, Howard's name endures, not because he sought recognition, but because his deeds made it impossible to ignore. He was the lone defender that day, but his courage lifted hundreds to safety, and inspired countless others to believe that one man could, indeed, make a difference. As James Howard's Medal of Honor ceremony drew national attention, the weight of that recognition sat quietly on his shoulders. He had not fought for medals, nor had he risked his life over Austersleben for fame or legacy. It had been instinct, shaped by his years of flying, sharpened by the harsh realities of combat, and born from a profound sense of duty to those around him. The B-17 crews he saved that day remembered him not just as a skilled pilot but as a guardian in the sky, a lone sentinel who faced a storm of gunfire without hesitation. Back at Leiston Airfield, where the 354th Fighter Group operated, Howard was greeted with admiration and deep respect. His fellow pilots looked at him differently, not just because of his medal or press coverage, but because they knew what it meant to take on so many enemies alone. Fighter pilots understood better than anyone that courage wasn't about defiance, it was about staying in the fight when logic told you to turn back. Howard's leadership after Austersleben evolved into something more personal. He wasn't just giving mission briefings or leading formations, he was mentoring younger pilots, sharing everything he had learned in the skies over China and Europe. He often emphasized discipline over glory, control over showmanship. He knew firsthand that survival wasn't guaranteed, and recklessness could cost a man his life or his wingman's. To Howard, every mission was an equation of risk, instinct, and honor. The P-51 Mustang continued to prove itself as the war's premier escort fighter, and the 354th Fighter Group, though originally deployed as part of the 9th Air Force, earned a fierce reputation even among 8th Air Force units. Howard, though never the loudest or most flamboyant of commanders, set a tone of professionalism that rippled through his squadron. His combat experience from the Pacific Theater with the Flying Tigers made him a rare breed. Most pilots in Europe had trained in the States and come directly into the European theater. Howard had already faced the pressure of real combat in the jungles of Burma, where visibility was poor, the conditions were brutal, and engagements often occurred at low altitude with no backup. That jungle dogfighting, he often said, taught him how to rely on feel and instinct. Now, over Germany, it was different, high altitude, tightly coordinated missions, but the stakes were just as high. When he engaged enemy aircraft above the fatherland, he did so with the quiet assurance of a man who had been tested before. For every mission that went smoothly, there were others that did not. Howard lost men. Some simply failed to return. Others radioed damage or fire and were never heard from again. It was the hardest part of command, writing letters to families, carrying the weight of decisions made in the cockpit that affected the lives of others. He never let his grief show publicly, but inside he remembered every pilot lost under his watch. He made it a point to tell new arrivals, fly smart. It's not about how many kills you get. It's about coming back with your wingman. The Luftwaffe, by early 1944, was throwing everything it had at the bomber streams. From the nimble FW-190s to the aggressive Bf-109s, German fighters were well-trained and well-armed. The introduction of heavily armed bomber destroyers, like the twin-engine Bf-110s and Me-410s, posed a new kind of threat. Howard studied their tactics and often reworked his own squadron's formations to counter them. He believed in adapting fast. In combat, a few seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Despite growing pressure from the enemy, Howard's squadron maintained high success rates. Pilots trusted his judgment. He led by example, often taking point on dangerous missions, and never asking others to do what he wouldn't. He wasn't a man of many words during briefings, but his voice was steady, and his instructions were always clear. In the air, his calm radio presence became a source of reassurance. Howard's style contrasted with some of the more flamboyant aces of the era. While others painted nose art or gave dramatic interviews, Howard preferred the background. He was content to let his aircraft speak for him. His P-51 Mustang, often nicknamed Ding Hao, a Chinese phrase meaning very good, was a nod to his past, a tribute to his years in China and the AVG. Every time he climbed into that cockpit, he carried not just a weapon of war, but a piece of his personal history. The psychological toll of air combat, though rarely discussed openly among pilots, was something Howard understood intimately. The loss of friends, the constant awareness that the next mission could be the last, and the strange guilt that accompanied survival, all of it stayed with him. There were nights when the base was quiet, and he would sit alone, looking at the sky, thinking of those who hadn't come home. It was the kind of silence that could never be filled by awards or recognition. In late 1944, as the Allied air offensive intensified, Howard was promoted to lieutenant colonel and transferred to a higher-level command role. He now oversaw broader strategic planning, no longer flying daily combat missions but still deeply connected to those who did. His shift in position allowed him to influence not just one squadron but multiple units. He advocated strongly for improved pilot training, particularly emphasizing discipline, situational awareness, and fuel management, an often overlooked element that could leave a pilot stranded far from safety. Howard's reputation among both Allied airmen and even captured Luftwaffe pilots was one of respect. Stories circulated of German aviators who, after the war, acknowledged the skill and bravery of the man who once stood alone against so many. It wasn't admiration for his nationality, it was admiration for the code he lived by. As the war neared its end, Howard began to consider life after conflict. He had seen enough destruction for a lifetime. Though the camaraderie of the fighter squadron was something he'd never forget, he longed for a life that didn't revolve around war. He wanted to build, not destroy, to create something enduring. He began writing, partly as therapy and partly to preserve the stories of the men he'd served with. He felt that history often remembered the leaders and battles, but not the faces in the cockpit, the subtle sacrifices, the quiet moments before takeoff. When Germany surrendered and victory was declared, Howard was relieved, not with joy, but with quiet gratitude that the killing had stopped. He returned to the United States a national hero, but never acted like one. Reporters followed him, veterans groups invited him to speak, and documentary filmmakers wanted his stories. He obliged when he felt it served a purpose, educating others, honoring fallen comrades, but he always avoided the spotlight when he could. Howard entered the private sector with the same meticulous focus that had defined his military career. He became an executive in the aerospace industry, lending his expertise to the evolving world of aviation and defense. His insights were valued not only because of his experience but because of his clarity. He didn't speak in vague strategies or emotional anecdotes. He spoke in data, in flight characteristics, in the needs of the pilot on the line. Over the years, Howard's story continued to inspire generations of aviators. His Medal of Honor mission was taught at flight schools, used in leadership seminars, and referenced in articles about valor. But what most people never saw were the quiet actions, the letters he continued to write to families, the scholarships he supported for children of airmen, the young pilots he mentored long after his uniform was put away. He lived long enough to see the aircraft he once flew become museum pieces, their aluminum skin polished and mounted in hangars, their stories told through audio tours and faded photographs. Yet for Howard, those machines were never just metal, they were part of something living. Every time he walked past a P-51 Mustang, his eyes lingered not on the wings or guns, but on the cockpit. That was where everything happened, where fear was managed, where decisions were made in the span of heartbeats, where men measured their worth in the face of fire. Even as age caught up with him, Howard remained sharp, his posture still upright, his tone still measured. In interviews, he often redirected praise to his squadron or the bomber crews. He never referred to himself as a hero. "I was a pilot," he would say. "I was doing my job." That humility became part of his legend. The truth, however, was that Howard had redefined what one man could do in combat. His mission over Ostersleben wasn't just about skill, it was about resolve, sacrifice, and protecting others at all costs. It embodied the highest ideals of aerial warfare, not in destruction, but in defense. He fought not because he hated what was in front of him, but because he loved what was behind him, the men in the bombers, his comrades in the squadron, and the freedom they all believed in. Howard passed away in 1995 at the age of 81, having lived a life that few could even dream of. He had seen war in 2 theaters, earned the nation's highest honor, and lived to reflect on it all with dignity. His legacy is not just in the medals or history books, it is in every pilot who learns that courage sometimes means flying into the storm alone. By the late stages of the war, James Howard had become more than just a pilot or commander. He had become a symbol of a rare kind of courage that could only emerge under the most intense and lonely pressures. Yet even in the final chapters of World War II, as victory drew closer, Howard refused to grow complacent. He remained vigilant in the role of leadership, often reminding fellow officers that wars could be lost even in their final moments if overconfidence or carelessness took hold. When he was moved into higher command, Howard had to leave behind the intimacy of squadron life. Gone were the days when he could share breakfast with his pilots, personally brief them, and walk among the aircraft on the line. Instead, he now dealt with larger logistics, mission strategies, and operations across broader regions. But even in this more detached position, his mind constantly returned to the young men flying into harm's way every day. He read every report, analyzed engagement summaries, and quietly kept tabs on the casualty lists. He never allowed himself to forget that each number represented a name, a story, a family. Though no longer leading formations into enemy skies, Howard's presence was felt in every sortie his old unit flew. His legacy had become part of the squadron culture, a standard to measure oneself against. Pilots carried his story with them like a quiet oath. The name James Howard came up in conversations before missions, a reminder that one man, armed with skill and resolve, could turn the tide of a battle. Back in the States, the legend of his lone action over Ostersleben took on a life of its own. The press wrote glowing features, painting him as a fearless airman who defied logic and odds. While these stories captured the drama of the moment, they often missed the core of what truly made Howard exceptional. It wasn't just that he attacked a formation of enemy fighters alone, it was that he chose to stay, again and again, not out of pride, but out of unwavering responsibility. Each decision to turn back toward the bombers, each trigger pull, each evasive maneuver, all of it was made with others in mind. He did not fly to chase kills. He flew to protect lives. Howard's own reflections on that mission remained understated. When asked about it in interviews, he often smiled quietly and redirected the conversation. "I did what needed to be done," he would say. "That's all there was to it." But for those who studied the mission in detail, the action spoke louder than any headline. His aircraft had sustained damage. His fuel had run low. His guns had emptied. Yet none of these stopped him until the threat was gone. After the war, Howard stepped away from the military but continued to serve in ways that were less visible. He worked in aviation and public service, eventually being appointed as the Director of Aeronautics for Missouri. He also entered the business world, where his calm authority and thoughtful leadership won him respect in boardrooms just as it had in briefing rooms. But even as the world around him moved into the jet age and beyond, Howard's mind often returned to propeller-driven days, to the roar of the P-40s over Rangoon, to the hum of the Mustangs over Germany, and to the faces of men he flew with, many of whom never came home. He visited old squadron mates when he could, attended reunions, and made appearances at air shows not for recognition, but for connection. He wanted to remind people that the war had been fought by individuals, each with a story, each with a moment where they were asked to give everything. His experiences with the Flying Tigers were perhaps the most formative. In the thick jungles and chaotic skies of Burma and China, Howard had learned the essence of improvisation, courage, and survival. Unlike the structured formations and high-altitude precision of European operations, the AVG had operated in a wild, unpredictable environment. There, Howard learned to read enemy intent in the twitch of a wing, to use terrain as a shield, to strike first or vanish fast. It was a hard school, one with no second chances. The things he learned in that crucible never left him. Flying with the Flying Tigers had also connected Howard emotionally to a land he had once called home. Fighting alongside the Chinese against overwhelming odds gave him a broader sense of global struggle and human cost. He had seen villages bombed, civilians fleeing on foot, wounded soldiers with no hope of medical care. He never romanticized war. He saw it for what it was: destruction, suffering, and sacrifice. In contrast, Europe had been clinical, industrial, efficient. Yet no less brutal. The scale of the bombing raids, the firestorms in cities, the loss of bomber crews by the dozen, it haunted him. He knew the war had to be fought. He knew what was at stake. But he also carried the sorrow of it in his heart for the rest of his life. In the decades that followed, Howard continued to speak occasionally at military academies and veterans gatherings. He urged young officers to remember that leadership was not about rank or medals. It was about responsibility. About making decisions that others depended on. About standing firm when others needed you most. In his rare public appearances, Howard was always courteous but reserved. He didn't enjoy the spotlight. If a reporter asked about the Medal of Honor, he would nod politely, acknowledge the honor, and then turn the conversation to the men he served with. He would mention the bomber crews he saved. He would tell their stories. He always said the real heroes were the ones who never came home. He did, however, take pride in helping preserve the legacy of air power. He worked quietly to support museums, air heritage foundations, and war memorial projects. He donated personal items to exhibitions, wrote letters in support of preserving aircraft, and provided insights to historians researching the evolution of fighter tactics in World War II. One of his greatest joys came later in life, when he stood beside a restored P-51 Mustang, painted in the exact scheme as Ding Hao, and watched it take off into the sky. As the engine roared and the aircraft climbed, Howard's eyes followed it, filled with memories of the missions, the friends, the adrenaline, and the silence that always followed when the fight was over. That Mustang was more than a plane, it was a part of him, a piece of a chapter written in the most critical years of the 20th century. In those years after the war, Howard also began writing, not for publication at first, but for clarity. His memoirs, eventually published as Roar of the Tiger, were honest, unflinching, and deeply reflective. He wrote about fear, about leadership, about moments when he questioned everything. He wrote not to glorify, but to explain. He wanted future generations to understand the realities behind the medals and citations. He believed that history, if told truthfully, could guide the future. He wanted young people to understand that bravery was often a quiet decision, made in solitude. That the men in the war were not myths, but ordinary individuals who rose to the moment when it demanded everything of them. In his personal life, Howard married and raised a family. He never imposed his legacy on his children. To them, he was a father first, a man who taught them discipline, kindness, and perseverance. He rarely spoke of the war unless asked directly. But in his eyes, there was always a trace of the skies he had once flown through, a distant look that spoke of lives lost, of clouds torn by bullets, of sunlight glinting off enemy wings. As the years passed and the generation of World War II aged, Howard stood as one of the remaining figures who had shaped the outcome from the cockpit of a fighter plane. He remained humble, always conscious of the fact that history often forgets the many in favor of the few. He made it his mission to remember those who could no longer speak for themselves. When the Vietnam War broke out, and later when conflicts erupted in the Middle East, Howard watched with a sense of sorrow. He hoped that lessons from his generation would be remembered. He feared that wars would always find new ways to begin, no matter how many had already been fought. In his final years, Howard found peace in reflection. He read history voraciously, studied changes in aerial warfare, and kept up with new fighter technology. But in his heart, he remained attached to the old days, to the thunder of radial engines, to hand-turned propellers, to the bond between men who faced the unknown with nothing but a few hundred gallons of fuel and a machine that shook with every burst of speed. When he passed in 1995, tributes came from every corner of the aviation world. Pilots, historians, generals, and everyday citizens all paused to remember a man who had once stood alone in the skies to protect others. His funeral was modest, just as he had wished. But among those present were former comrades, bomber crewmen who had survived that day in January 1944, and younger aviators who had grown up hearing the story of the lone Mustang over Ostersleben. His legacy is not etched in stone alone. It lives in the flight paths of every escort mission. In the doctrine of every Air Force that teaches the value of commitment. In the hearts of those who believe that one person, guided by conviction, can alter the course of events. The story of James Howard does not end with medals or aging headlines, it endures because it represents something that transcends time and technology. In every era, there are those who quietly rise when the moment calls, who act not for recognition but because of a deep sense of what must be done. Howard's legacy lives not in the past but in the present, wherever people believe in integrity over glory and action over words. Though he spent most of his post-war life in relative quiet, Howard's impact remained present in more ways than most realized. His name became a fixture in military aviation schools, not just for the valor of a single mission but for his entire arc, from naval aviator, to flying tiger, to European theater commander. His journey served as a blueprint for leadership, adaptability, and moral clarity. Younger generations of airmen found in him an ideal to aspire to. In simulator rooms and flight classrooms, instructors would recount the story of the Mustang that wouldn't leave the bombers. They would point out that Howard didn't know whether backup was coming. He had no way of knowing whether he would survive, or if anyone would even remember what he did. That was the heart of the lesson: real courage exists when there are no guarantees. In the years after his death, a number of memorials and tributes were created in his honor. Museums added his flight jacket, logbooks, and photographs to their exhibits. Aircraft restoration groups painted P-51s in the colors of Ding Hao, flying them in airshows to honor the men who once defended the skies over Europe. At one commemorative event, a restored B-17 flew in formation with a P-51 bearing Howard's name. The scene was breathtaking, silent, deeply emotional, evoking a time when the fate of nations hung in the balance, and men like Howard flew to meet it. Even outside of aviation circles, Howard's story found new life. Writers, filmmakers, and teachers saw in his tale a timeless narrative, one person, in a moment of overwhelming danger, choosing to act selflessly. It resonated across cultures and generations, especially in an age where heroism had come to be associated with spectacle. Howard reminded people that true heroism is quiet, often unrecognized in the moment, and always rooted in the needs of others. As war veterans grew older and the number of living witnesses to World War II dwindled, Howard's accounts became even more important. His memoir Roar of the Tiger was republished and included in educational collections. Students read about his time with the AVG and how that experience hardened him into a leader of rare composure. They read about his view of war, not romanticized, not simplified, but raw and human. Those who spoke with him in his final years remembered him as gracious and deliberate. His memory remained sharp, and his thoughts on combat never drifted toward nostalgia. Instead, he expressed hope that younger generations would never have to experience what his had. He didn't glorify war, he contextualized it. He understood its necessity at times but emphasized its consequences always. For Howard, the machines of war were never just tools, they were responsibilities. Each time a young pilot asked him what it was like to fly the Mustang, he spoke of the aircraft not as a machine to admire, but as a vessel that had carried many brave men to their final moments. He respected the power of flight, but he revered the men who gave their lives in the sky. Among the many personal letters he wrote, one stood out. It was a note to a young aspiring pilot who had read about his Medal of Honor mission. The boy asked, "Were you afraid?" Howard's reply was short but profound, "Yes. But courage is not the absence of fear, it's deciding to act even when fear is there." That simple sentence encapsulated everything Howard stood for. In the broader view of history, James Howard was one of many who served with honor. But within the tightly knit world of aerial combat, he was singular. His combination of experience, humility, intelligence, and sheer bravery made him a figure unlike any other. He had fought in both theaters of the greatest war in history. He had learned in the crucible of Asia, adapted in the storm of Europe, and commanded with a quiet authority that others naturally followed. The world changed drastically after the war. Jet engines replaced propellers. Satellites circled the Earth. Wars became remote, fought with drones and cyber operations. But some truths remained the same. The need for courage, for conscience, for leadership under fire, those never changed. And so, long after his final flight, Howard's story continued to be told not as a relic, but as a compass. There were moments, even in old age, when he would sit near an airstrip and watch younger pilots take off. His eyes would track their climb, the angle of ascent, the shape of the formation. He would nod subtly, recognizing the motions, the decisions behind every turn. He never judged. He understood that every generation had its own battles, its own kind of skies. Howard's personal archive was eventually donated to various museums and military institutions. Within those boxes were letters, maps, photographs, and the flight logs that documented a life in the air. His notes were meticulous. Every detail mattered. Reading them was like entering a different world, one where survival depended on every degree of pitch, every second of delay. But scattered throughout those technical details were moments of quiet reflection. Notes like, "Smith didn't make it. Good man." Or, "Clear sky over the target. We were lucky today." Those small sentences carried the full weight of war. In many ways, Howard's legacy grew strongest after he was gone. Not because of increasing recognition, but because the values he embodied became harder to find. His type of leadership, calm, ethical, decisive, stood in contrast to the noise of modern fame. He didn't seek credit. He sought clarity. He didn't boast about what he did. He measured his impact by those he protected. In later years, pilots who trained under his influence rose to high ranks. Some credited him directly, others never met him but studied his decisions. His name appeared in manuals, his mission dissected in training sessions. But no document could capture the full reality of what it was like to be alone in that sky, to face wave after wave of enemy fighters, and to never turn away. Perhaps the most enduring tribute to Howard isn't in statues or written citations. It's in the way his actions reshaped expectations. Before Ostersleben, most didn't believe one fighter could truly stand alone and succeed. After Howard, they believed differently. His mission became a symbol of what was possible, not just in combat, but in character. It is easy to remember the image of AP-51 diving into a swarm of enemy aircraft, guns blazing, a single contrail carving a line through the sky. But the real power of that image lies in the choice behind it. Howard could have turned back. He could have claimed he had done his part. But he stayed. And in staying, he changed history, not just for the bombers he saved, but for the generations who would come to understand what leadership truly meant. When modern Air Force cadets visit museums or study doctrine, they still find Howard's name. Not because of how many aircraft he destroyed, but because of the life he led. A life rooted in discipline, in sacrifice, and in the unshakable belief that duty comes first. James Howard was a warrior, yes, but more than that, he was a man of conscience. His flying career was filled with danger and glory, but his legacy is built on something deeper: the strength to act when no one else could, the grace to carry that responsibility without ego, and the wisdom to remind others that real power lies in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Mustang he once flew is long grounded, its engine silent. But in the hearts of those who understand what happened on that day in 1944, who remember what it means to stay behind for others, James Howard still flies.